The wagon wheel cracked clean in half on a Tuesday morning in late April of 1873, leaving Celia Graves stranded in the middle of the Kansas prairie with nothing but a leather satchel, a rosary her mother had pressed into her hands in Guadalajara, and a terror so deep it had stopped feeling like fear and started feeling like a second skin. She had been traveling for 6 weeks. 6 weeks of cramped train cars and bumping stagecoaches and roads that were not really roads at all, just suggestions pressed into the earth by boots and hooves. She had crossed the border at El Paso with a group of families heading north toward the railroad towns, hoping to find work, hoping to find something resembling a future. She was 22 years old, and the only English words she had learned before leaving Mexico were yes, no, water, and thank you, which she had rehearsed over and over on the long journey north until they felt like prayers rather than language. Now the wagon she had paid her last peso to ride in had shed its wheel like a wounded animal dropping a leg, and the driver, a lean and irritable man named Perkins who smelled of sour tobacco, had declared the whole venture finished. He unhitched his good horse, tied his belongings to its back, and rode east without looking at her twice. The two other passengers, a mother and her grown son from somewhere north of San Antonio, had walked off following the road while Celia was still standing in the grass, trying to understand what had just happened. The prairie stretched in every direction without apology. The sky above it was enormous and pale blue, and the wind came across the flat land in long, continuous sighs that pressed the grass down in waves. It was beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they are also terrifying. Celia stood beside the broken wagon and held her satchel against her chest and looked in every direction and saw nothing that looked like a town, nothing that looked like shelter, nothing that looked like help. She did the only sensible thing she could think of. She sat down on the grass beside the road and waited, because her mother had always told her that when you are lost, you stay still so that the people who love you can find you. Her mother was not here, and no one who loved her was anywhere on this continent, but the advice seemed reasonable regardless. She had been sitting there for perhaps an hour watching clouds build slowly in the west when she heard the sound of hooves. Not one horse, several. Homer Hartwell was 30 years old and had been riding the same stretch of Kansas grassland since he was 17, first as a hired hand on his uncle's cattle operation, and then, when his uncle died without a will and a distant cousin from Ohio, had arrived to claim everything, as a man who owned exactly one horse, one saddle, 2 changes of clothes, and a 160-acre homestead claim that the government had given him under the Homestead Act 5 years prior. The land was his if he worked it, and he had worked it, and it was beginning to look like something. He had a house that was more than a dugout now, real timber walls and a solid roof, a small barn, a garden patch that his neighbor Mrs. Aldrich had helped him plant in beans and corn, and 40 head of cattle that ranged over his claim and the open land beyond it. He was riding with his hired man, a young Tejano named Rodrigo Espinoza, coming back from the town of Caldwell where they had been to file some paperwork at the land office, when Rodrigo spotted the broken wagon first. "Someone is having a bad day," Rodrigo said in English, because his English was excellent, having been born in Texas and schooled by a determined German missionary woman in San Antonio. Homer squinted. He could see the wagon, wheelless and tilted on one side, and he could see a shape sitting in the grass beside it. As they rode closer, the shape resolved itself into a young woman, dark-haired and straight-backed, sitting very still with a bag pressed to her chest like she was holding the whole of her courage inside it. Homer pulled his horse up a polite distance away and touched the brim of his hat. "Good afternoon, ma'am. You all right?" The young woman looked up at him with eyes the color of deep river water, dark brown with flecks of amber, and there was something in her expression that was not quite fear and not quite relief, but something suspended between the two. She said something that he did not understand at all, something soft and rapid in Spanish. Homer looked at Rodrigo. Rodrigo said something in Spanish. The woman answered. There was a back-and-forth exchange, and then Rodrigo turned to Homer with the particular expression of a man who has been handed a complicated situation and is deciding how to describe it. "Her name is Celia Graves," Rodrigo said. "The Graves part she got from her husband who died 2 years back, an Anglo man she married in Monterey. She came north looking for work. The wagon driver abandoned her, and she has been sitting here for about an hour. She has no water left, and she does not know where she is." Homer looked at the woman, at Celia Graves, who was watching him with careful dark eyes while he processed this information. "Ask her if she's hurt," Homer said. Rodrigo asked. She shook her head and said something brief. "Not hurt," Rodrigo reported. "Only stranded and thirsty." Homer swung down from his horse and unslung his canteen from the saddle horn and walked it over to her. He held it out. She took it with both hands and drank carefully, not greedily, with the measured restraint of someone who had learned not to waste water on a long journey. She handed it back and said 2 words that Homer recognized, because they were the same in any language when said with that particular tone. "Thank you," she said in English, careful and deliberate, and then looked at him like she was waiting to see if she had said it correctly. "You're welcome," Homer said. He looked at the broken wagon, then at the horizon where those clouds in the west were getting darker and more purposeful. He looked at Rodrigo. "Storm's coming," Rodrigo said. "Probably by nightfall." Homer did not deliberate long. He was not a man who found deliberation comfortable. He thought in straight lines, and the straight line here was obvious. There was a woman alone on the prairie with a storm coming. His homestead was 4 miles west. The math was simple. "Tell her I'll take her to my place until we can figure out where she was headed and get her there," Homer said. Rodrigo translated. Celia Graves listened. She looked at Homer for a long moment, that same careful measuring gaze, and then she looked at Rodrigo and said something else. "She wants to know if you are a good man," Rodrigo said. Homer blinked. He was not accustomed to being asked this question directly. He thought about it. "Tell her I try to be," he said. Rodrigo translated. Celia considered. Then she stood up, smoothed her skirt, picked up her satchel, and walked toward Homer's horse with the dignity of a woman who had made harder decisions than this one. Homer helped her up into the saddle and mounted behind her, and they rode west with the storm building at their backs, and neither of them said anything because they had no words in common, but the silence between them was not uncomfortable, which Homer thought was strange and did not think about too deeply because he was busy watching the sky. His homestead came into view as the last light was turning golden and strange ahead of the storm. It was not grand, his place, but it was solid and honest, and he was quietly proud of it in the way that people are proud of things they have built with their own hands. The house sat low against the rise of a gentle hill, timber-framed with a covered porch that he had added 2 summers ago. There was a kitchen garden coming in green along the south side, and the barn was newer than the house and sturdier, because a man in cattle country knew that priorities were priorities. Celia said something when she saw it, something quiet that Rodrigo did not translate, but her voice had a softness in it that Homer noticed. He got the horses into the barn before the rain hit. Rodrigo lived in a small room attached to the barn that was his own private arrangement, comfortable and separate, and he went there after helping with the horses with a cheerfulness that suggested he found the whole situation entertaining. Homer did not ask him to elaborate on this opinion. Inside the house, Homer lit the lamp and built up the cook stove fire, and tried to think about how to communicate the basic hospitalities of a home to someone he could not speak to. He pointed at things. He said their names, and she repeated them carefully, testing the English syllables in her mouth like something she was tasting. Chair, table, stove, bread. He pointed at himself and said his name, Homer. She repeated it, frowning slightly at the H, making it a little more aspirated than he did, but unmistakably his name in her mouth. She pointed at herself. "Celia," she said. "Celia," he repeated, and she smiled for the first time, a quick bright thing that changed her whole face. He made dinner. It was not fancy, beans with salt pork and cornbread and coffee, but it was hot and she ate with the honest appetite of someone who had not had a proper meal in some time. The rain came hard against the windows, and the wind picked up, and the lamp swayed a little on its hook, and they sat across the table from each other, in a silence that kept not being as awkward as it should have been. Homer got out the small slate board he used for figuring accounts and wrote things on it and pointed at them, and she nodded or shook her head. He drew a rough map of the territory, indicated the nearest town, Caldwell, to the east, and she looked at it and then pointed to herself and made a gesture he took to mean she had no particular destination fixed. She had been heading north, generally, toward the railroad towns, looking for work. She pointed at the map where she thought she might want to go, and then shrugged in a way that was eloquent enough in any language. It said, "I am not sure. I was hoping for something better than this, but I have been moving so long that forward feels more familiar than any direction with a name." Homer understood this feeling. He had had years of it before he found his land. He showed her where she could sleep, the small back room he used for storage that had a proper bed in it from when his mother had visited 2 years ago. He had kept it made up out of habit or optimism or some feeling he hadn't examined. He pointed at it and then walked out and closed the door, and she was safe and sheltered while the prairie storm did what prairie storms do, which is announce themselves with total authority. In the morning, the storm had moved on east and left the world washed and brilliant, and Rodrigo made coffee in the barn kitchen, and Homer stood on the porch watching the light come up across the wet grass and thought about what came next. What came next, he decided, was that Rodrigo would help him establish what Celia actually needed and wanted, and they would figure out from there how to help her get it. This was the reasonable, practical approach. He had not thought yet about how her eyes looked in lamplight. He was not thinking about that. At breakfast, which Celia contributed to in a decisive way by taking over the eggs before Homer could demonstrate that scrambling eggs was not his strongest skill, Rodrigo served as interpreter, and they had their first real conversation. She had been born in Guadalajara. She had learned some reading from nuns in a church school. Her husband, a man named David Graves, who had been a trader working routes through northern Mexico, had died of fever 2 years ago, leaving her with nothing but his name and a small amount of grief that she described with a composed matter-of-factness that suggested the marriage had been practical rather than passionate. She had family, distant cousins in the South, but the opportunities in Guadalajara were thin for a widow woman with no dowry and no land. She had heard that Kansas and the territories had work, that women who could cook and sew and keep house were needed, and so she had come north. "What kind of work is she looking for?" Homer asked Rodrigo. Rodrigo asked. There was a longer exchange. "She says she can cook, sew, keep house, garden, and she is very good with livestock. She says her father had horses and she knows how to work with animals." Homer looked at her across the table. She was watching him with that steady, assessing gaze again. "Tell her," Homer said slowly, "that I have been needing a cook and housekeeper here for some time, and I would be glad to pay fair wages if she wanted to stay on for a while until she finds something more permanent." Rodrigo translated this. Celia's expression shifted through several things in a short time. Consideration, assessment, a little suspicion that Homer did not hold against her because it was sensible, then something that might have been relief or might have been something more complicated. She said something to Rodrigo with a direct, businesslike tone. "She wants to know the terms," Rodrigo said. "Her own room, fair wages, no interference with how she manages the house, and if you behave improperly she will leave immediately." "That's reasonable," Homer said, and was aware that he was trying not to smile and was not entirely succeeding. Rodrigo conveyed this. Celia looked at Homer, and he met her eyes and nodded once slowly in the universal language of a person giving their word. She nodded back. They had a deal. The first weeks were a negotiation of spaces and rhythms. Celia took hold of the household with a quiet confidence that startled Homer, who had been used to things being functional but not particularly pleasant. Within 3 days, the kitchen smelled different, richer, layered with things he could not name but could not stop wanting to be near. She found his neglected garden and expanded it with a decisiveness that he admired. She organized the storage room, fixed a hinge on the barn door that had been sticking since September without Homer getting around to it, and figured out by watching Rodrigo work that the right fence post on the north pasture was rotting at its base. She told Homer about the fence post by drawing it on the slate board with a precision that was almost architectural. He went and checked, and she was entirely right. He was impressed. He was also, increasingly, aware of her in a way that was becoming impossible to dismiss as mere practical regard. The language problem was real and enormous, and it should have created an insurmountable distance between them. And yet it did not, quite, and this was because of several things. First, Rodrigo was willing to translate in the evenings when they were all gathered after supper, and these translation sessions became a kind of ritual that Homer started looking forward to with a warmth he didn't examine too closely. Second, both Celia and Homer were discovering that they were both inclined toward observation and gesture, toward pointing and drawing and demonstrating, and they could communicate quite a lot this way without any words at all. Third, and most confoundingly, there seemed to be something between them that didn't require language, some current of understanding that moved through a look or a moment of shared attention, something that Homer had never experienced with anyone before, and that kept surprising him when it happened. He started learning Spanish. He did it quietly, sitting up late at night with a Spanish grammar he had sent Rodrigo to retrieve from the small lending library the Caldwell Church kept, working through it with the same patient stubbornness he brought to fixing fences and cutting timber. It was hard. The words were slippery, and the grammar seemed to operate on principles his English-trained brain resisted. But he kept at it. Celia was learning English at the same time, and Rodrigo noticed and was amused, and said nothing to either of them for a while, watching the whole thing with the fond exasperation of a man watching two people build toward the same bridge from opposite banks. On an evening about a month after Celia arrived, she came and sat beside Homer on the porch after supper, which she had not done before, and they sat in a comfortable silence watching the prairie go gold and then rose and then the deep blue of coming dark. Homer had been practicing a sentence in Spanish for 2 days. He said it carefully, aware that his pronunciation was probably terrible. "Cómo fue su día?" He had asked how her day was. He knew he had probably mangled it. She turned and looked at him with an expression that he could not fully read, but that had something moved in it, something surprised and pleased, and a little undone. She answered him in Spanish, slowly, watching his face to see how much he understood. He understood about a third of it. He held up his hand and she stopped, and he found his grammar book, which he had started carrying in his coat pocket because he was that kind of man, and he looked up the words he hadn't known and then nodded and said, haltingly in Spanish, that he understood now. She laughed. It was a real laugh, unguarded and warm, and it was the first time he had heard it fully, and it did something to him that he would spend the next several weeks trying to explain to himself and never quite managing. She said something else, something short and clear, and then said the English translation herself right after because she had looked it up too. "You are learning," she said in English. "So are you," he said. They sat in the evening together, and the conversation they managed, cobbled from 2 languages and a lot of gesturing at the sky and the land, was slow and imperfect and absolutely the most interesting conversation Homer Hartwell had had in his 30 years on Earth. July brought a dry spell and the kind of heat that sat on the Kansas prairie like a physical weight, pressing down on everything. The cattle needed moving to find water, and Homer and Rodrigo were out on the range for long days, coming back sun-scorched and exhausted to find the house cool and dim and dinner waiting. And Homer started to understand what the house had lacked before in a way that went far beyond cooking and clean floors. Mrs. Aldrich, his neighbor whose farm was 2 miles east, came to call one afternoon while Homer was out. She was a widow of 50-some years, sharp-tongued and warm-hearted in equal measure, and she had been Homer's nearest neighbor and occasional conscience for the 5 years he had been on the claim. She found Celia in the kitchen, and the two women spent an afternoon together that Celia described to Homer that evening, laughing as she told it, miming out the shapes of Mrs. Aldrich's gestures and expressions. Homer could see from the laughter that it had gone well, and he felt something ease in him that he hadn't known was tense. He had been, he realized, a little worried about Celia's isolation. She had Rodrigo for conversation in her own language, and that was something, but he had wondered if she was lonely for women's company. Mrs. Aldrich arrived the next day with a determined expression and announced to Homer that she was going to teach Celia English properly. "She's quick, Mrs. Aldrich said. "Quicker than you, and I once spent a winter teaching you to read cursive. No offense meant." "Some taken," Homer said. Mrs. Aldrich grinned. "She also makes the best tamales I have ever had in my life, and I ate them for 3 days after she sent me home with some, and I am going to come here every other day for the foreseeable future, and if that inconveniences you, Homer James Hartwell, you can say so, and I will not change a single thing." Homer said it did not inconvenience him at all. He was also aware that Mrs. Aldrich was watching him with an expression that older women who have seen many things tend to wear when they are watching younger people make their slow way towards something the older person can already see clearly from a distance. He chose not to comment on this. What Homer had not anticipated about having a person in his house who saw things clearly and acted on what she saw was that the farm itself would transform. It was not just the house, though the house was genuinely better, warmer and more organized and fed with food that made Rodrigo express religious gratitude on a regular basis. It was the whole operation. Celia noticed things. She noticed that the kitchen garden was producing more than they could use and suggested, through a combination of Spanish and her growing English and drawings on the slate, that they sell the excess in Caldwell on market days. She noticed that the horses were being fed in an inefficient pattern and rearranged it. She noticed that the barn cat was pregnant and prepared for this in advance, so that when the kittens came, there was a proper warm space for them instead of a catastrophe in the hay bales. She also noticed Homer. She was aware of him in the particular way that a careful and guarded person becomes aware of someone who is consistently kind without making a performance of it. He did not treat her as a curiosity or a charity case. He did not speak to her loudly or slowly as though she were not intelligent, which was a thing she had experienced from several people since arriving in Kansas. He treated her work with the same respect he gave any competent labor. He learned her language with serious dedication and brought his word-by-word progress to her like small offerings, words he had figured out, phrases he had practiced, and waited with genuine attentiveness to see if he had gotten them right. He was also, she had noted with careful objectivity, a very handsome man in the particular way of men who work outdoors and don't think about it, broad-shouldered and sun-browned with gray-blue eyes that could hold a landscape in them and crinkled at the corners when he was amused. She was objectively noting this because she was an observant person, and observation was not feeling. She told herself this on a fairly regular basis throughout July and into August. August brought trouble in the form of a man named Vance Caldwell, no relation to the town, who appeared one afternoon riding a flashy paint horse and wearing the careful clothes of someone who wanted to look prosperous without having put in the work to be prosperous. He rode onto Homer's land with the confidence of a man who did not think he needed to ask permission for anything, and got down from his horse in the yard with his hat already pushed back and a smile that Celia, watching from the kitchen window, recognized with an immediacy that lived in her spine. Homer was in the barn. Celia heard him come out, and she heard the exchange of voices, first easy, then less so, then with a tension that changed the quality of the air. She could not hear the words from the kitchen window, but the bodies told her enough. Homer's shoulders had gone a certain way, and Vance Caldwell was making the expansive gestures of someone who thought generosity and demand were the same thing. Rodrigo appeared at the kitchen door. "He's a land speculator," Rodrigo said, his voice low. "He has been buying up homestead claims from families who get into debt or get scared. He offered Homer money for the land twice before. He has come back to offer again." Celia looked at Rodrigo. "Homer will not sell," she said in Spanish. "No," Rodrigo agreed. "But Vance Caldwell is not accustomed to hearing no." Homer sent Caldwell away. The man rode out with the entitled slowness of someone saving face, and Homer stood in the yard watching him go with the contained anger of a man who has learned to keep his temper on a short leash. Then he turned and walked back toward the house, and his eyes found Celia in the kitchen window, because he had gotten into the habit of checking, and she met his gaze and nodded once, and something in him settled back into its proper place. He came inside and sat down at the table, and Celia poured him coffee without being asked, because she had noticed months ago that he needed coffee the way some men needed tobacco or whiskey, and she put it in front of him and sat across from him. "He wants the land," she said in English, because her English was getting stronger every week under Mrs. Aldrich's dedicated instruction. "He does," Homer agreed. "You will not give it," she said. "Never in my life," Homer said. She looked at him. He looked at her. The kitchen was warm and smelled of the bread she had been making, and outside the August afternoon was golden and enormous. "This is a good land," Celia said. "It is," Homer agreed, and the way he said it included the house and the barn and the cattle and the garden and the woman sitting across from him in a way that he did not intend to be as transparent as it probably was, but there it was. Celia looked down at her coffee cup and then back up and said, "I will stay, if you want me to stay." Homer was quiet for a moment. Then very carefully in Spanish he said, "Mi alegra que es aquí." He was glad she was here. She understood him perfectly. Her expression did that thing it did sometimes, the soft unguarding, and then she smiled into her coffee cup, and he looked out the window, and they both pretended that nothing of significance had just happened, which was, of course, the clearest possible sign that something of enormous significance had just happened. September came in cool and clear, the best month on the Kansas prairie, when the heat had let go and the sky had a particular clarity, and the grass went golden, and the morning smelled of something crisp and new. It was in September that the Caldwell community held its annual harvest gathering, a thing that involved most of the farming and ranching families within a 20-mile radius coming together at the town's central green for 2 days of trading and eating and music and general sociability. Homer told Celia about it through a combination of English, Spanish, and an elaborate pantomime involving dancing that made Rodrigo cover his mouth with his hat to conceal his laughter. Celia watched Homer's pantomime with a very straight face for about 30 seconds and then laughed so hard she had to sit down, and Homer stood there looking mortified for a moment, and then started laughing too, and it was the first time they had laughed together at the same thing at the same time, and the sound of it in the kitchen was something Rodrigo would remember for a long time. They went to the harvest gathering, the three of them, Homer driving the wagon. Celia wore a blue dress that she had made herself from fabric she had purchased in Caldwell on a market day, and she had done something with her dark hair that made it look both elegant and practical. And Homer, who had been standing by the wagon when she came out of the house, had completely failed to say anything for a moment, which was unlike him. "You look very fine," he said, in careful Spanish, because he had been practicing compliments, because apparently that was the kind of man he had become. She looked pleased and also slightly devastating. "Thank you," she said in English, and touched the sleeve of his coat in a small, deliberate gesture that he thought about for approximately the rest of the day. The harvest gathering was large and noisy, and full of the smells of cooking food and horses and autumn. Homer introduced Celia to people, and she was gracious and composed, and the fact that she could not yet hold a full conversation in English did not seem to diminish her at all. She had the quality that some people have of being present in a room without needing to speak, a kind of settled warmth that made people comfortable. Mrs. Aldrich arrived with the air of a woman who owned the event by virtue of personality and commandeered Celia immediately to help with the food tables, which were her domain, and the two of them worked side by side for an hour in a way that involved a great deal of rapid mixed-language conversation and laughter, and Mrs. Aldrich teaching Celia some English phrase that made Celia look scandalized and then laugh again. And Homer watched this from a respectable distance and felt something large and uncomplicated in his chest that he was beginning to stop pretending not to feel. There was a fiddle player and a guitar player who set up in the afternoon, and the dancing started. Homer was not a natural dancer, which was a fact about himself he had long accepted, but the fiddle player launched into a reel, and the crowd pulled together and he found himself in a line, and Celia was in the same line, and the dance required no shared language because the music carried everyone on it, and they moved through the steps together and apart and together again. And once, in a turning movement that the dance required, their hands met and held for the count of 8 beats. And neither of them let go before the music asked them to. There was a man at the gathering named Celia Graves, who worked for Vance Caldwell, and who had been watching Homer with the flat, measuring interest of someone keeping account. Homer noticed this in the way he noticed most things, quietly and without making a show of it. And he also noticed that Prout watched Celia with something less professional and more personal in his look. And Homer moved in the crowd in a way that was both casual and deliberate until he was standing near her. And she glanced at him, and then looked at Prout, and then back at Homer with a calm that said, "I see what you are doing and I appreciate it." And he was unreasonably pleased to be understood. The days grew shorter, and the work settled into the rhythms of autumn, the harvest to bring in, the cattle to move to their winter range, the house to prepare against cold. Celia and Homer were spending long evenings by the fire now, their language lessons having become something more like conversations that traveled between Spanish and English and back again. Sentences started in one language and finished in another, the grammar imperfect and the meaning absolutely clear. He told her about his uncle's farm and the cousin from Ohio, and the years of riding for other men's cattle before he filed his claim. He told it in his growing Spanish, halting and literal, and she listened with the particular quality of attention she gave to things that mattered. She told him about Guadalajara, about the house her father had kept with horses in the back, and the smell of the jacaranda trees in spring, and the sound of the city in the evenings. She told him about her father's death when she was 16 and the years after when money was tight and options were limited, and the marriage to David Graves that had been practical and not unhappy, but not this, not whatever this long evening firelight conversation was. She said that last part in Spanish quickly, and then looked at the fire. Homer said also in Spanish, also looking at the fire, "Yo tampoco he tenido esto." He had not had this either. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind moved across the prairie with its long, continuous voice. Neither of them looked at the other for a moment, and then both of them looked at the other at exactly the same moment, and the space between the two chairs they were sitting in seemed simultaneously very large and very small. "Homer," she said, and in her accent his name was a different and better thing. "Celia," he said, and he meant about 17 things by it, and she heard all of them. He reached across the space between the chairs and took her hand slowly, giving her every opportunity to not allow it, and she let him, and her hand was warm and real in his, and they sat like that by the fire for a long time while the prairie night went deep and wide around the house. It should be noted here that nothing else happened that evening, because Homer Hartwell was a man who believed in doing things properly, and doing things properly in 1873 on the Kansas prairie involved a certain sequence of events that he was now committed to completing in the correct order. The first thing he did the next morning was find Rodrigo in the barn. "I need to ask Celia something," Homer said, "and I need to say it in Spanish, and I need the Spanish to be absolutely correct." Rodrigo looked at him for a long moment with the expression of a man who has been watching something build for months and is experiencing the deep satisfaction of an anticipated outcome. "All right," he said. "I need to tell her that my intentions are serious," Homer said. "That I am not asking her to stay as a housekeeper anymore. That I am asking her to consider something permanent. That I want to court her properly, in those words or something close to them." Rodrigo took this very seriously and spent the better part of an hour working with Homer on the Spanish of it, the pronunciation, the phrasing, the way certain words needed to land to carry the weight Homer wanted them to carry. Homer repeated it until he had it right. He found Celia in the garden in the late morning, cutting the last of the autumn herbs before the hard frost came. She was kneeling in the dirt with the focused attention she brought to all physical work, her dark hair loose because she had not put it up yet and the morning sun on it. And Homer stood at the edge of the garden for a moment watching her and feeling the particular kind of dumb happiness that men feel when they are about to say something that matters. She looked up and saw him and straightened, brushing the dirt from her skirt. She said something in Spanish, something easy and domestic, something about the herbs. He said in Spanish the thing he had practiced. He said it carefully, without rushing, the way he had learned to say things in a language not his own, with the particular gravity that comes from choosing each word deliberately. He told her that his feelings for her were serious and real, that he wanted to know if she would allow him to court her with the intention of asking, when the time was right, if she would be his wife. That he knew they were still learning each other's languages, and that this might seem early, but that he had spent 30 years not feeling what he felt when she was in the room, and he did not think he had the patience for pretending otherwise. Celia stood in the garden holding her bundle of sage and rosemary and looked at him for a long moment. Her expression was unreadable for several heartbeats, and then it opened into something that was the most undefended thing he had ever seen on a human face, a kind of joy that was also almost sorrow because it was so unexpected, so larger than what she had allowed herself to hope for. She said something in Spanish. Then she said it again in English, slowly, making sure the words were exactly right because the words mattered. "I would like that very much," she said. Homer exhaled. He had not been aware he was holding his breath. She took a step toward him and he met her halfway, and he took both her hands in his, dirt and sage and all. And they stood in the autumn garden looking at each other like two people who have found something they had given up believing in. And it was not exactly a kiss, and not exactly anything else. Just a standing together in the clear, cold morning air, with the knowledge of what they were to each other made explicit at last. Mrs. Aldrich arrived that afternoon as though summoned by some frontier telegraph system that Homer had no access to, and declared it wonderful news, and produced a jar of preserves from her basket, as though she had been carrying them in anticipation. "I knew in June," she told Homer, "and I would have told you, but you seemed like you needed to get there yourself." "Thank you for the restraint," Homer said. Mrs. Aldrich patted his arm. "Don't mention it. You were only about a season and a half slower than I expected. I factored in the language problem." Celia's English had grown strong enough by now that she caught most of this exchange and laughed, and Mrs. Aldrich laughed with her, and Homer stood between the two of them feeling outmaneuvered and pleased about it. The courtship was conducted with a proper formality that meant something to both of them. That meant Homer called it a courtship and treated it as such. That there were evenings spent at the fire talking and not talking and walking in the last of the autumn evenings. That there were small attentions and small courtesies between them that accumulated into something very large. That there was a kind of sweetness to the slowness of it, to the building. There was a complication in October that Homer had not anticipated. A letter arrived at the Caldwell post office addressed to him, and it was from a woman named Agnes Whitmore, who was the mother of a young woman in Ohio who had apparently heard through a mutual acquaintance that Homer Hartwell of Caldwell, Kansas, was a bachelor with a solid homestead claim and might be open to the idea of a wife. The letter was well written and warm, and made it clear that if Homer was agreeable, her daughter would be willing to correspond. Homer wrote back the same day, a polite and brief letter saying that he was no longer available, that he hoped the young woman in Ohio would find a good situation, and that he wished them well. He did not know he had been holding the letter when he came out of the post office until Celia, who had come to town with him for market day, noticed his expression. She raised her eyebrows. He showed her the letter because he believed in being honest, and Rodrigo read it for her because her English was good but not yet fast enough for unfamiliar handwriting. She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked him what he had written back. He told her. Something in her expression shifted and softened, and she nodded, and then she did something she had not done in public before. She put her hand through his arm, a small claim, a small public declaration, and they walked through the Caldwell market together like that. And Homer found that he was very nearly smiling for the entire rest of the afternoon. Vance Caldwell made his third appearance in November, and this time he came not to Homer's land but to the Caldwell General Store when Homer and Celia were both inside, and he was not alone. He had two men with him and the air of someone who has decided to take a different approach. He spoke to Homer, but he watched Celia while he talked, and what he said was designed to be heard by both of them. He said that homesteading was a hard life for a man alone, and harder still for a man trying to manage a woman who couldn't even speak the language. And wouldn't Homer find it easier to take a good cash price for the land and go somewhere with better prospects? He knew a good setup in Abilene where a man like Homer could do well, and the woman could find a place in one of the establishments there that would suit her situation, meaning there was nothing respectful in what he was suggesting. Homer set down the flour sack he was holding and looked at Vance Caldwell with an expression that was very calm and very flat and entirely serious. He said, "You're going to take yourself and your men out of this store right now, and you're not going to speak to me or come on my land again. And if you say another word about that woman, I am going to forget that I am a patient man." He said it quietly, without heat, which made it more rather than less convincing. Caldwell measured him for a moment. Then he looked at his men, and something was silently decided, and he walked out. The storekeeper, a man named Fletcher who had been behind his counter with an expression of deep discomfort, let out a long breath. The two other customers in the store found reasons to look elsewhere. Homer turned to Celia. She had stood perfectly still during the exchange, her expression neutral, and she had understood enough of the English to understand the shape of what had been said. She said in Spanish, "He will not be back." "No," Homer agreed. "He won't." She looked at him for a moment with an expression that he was learning to recognize, the one that came before she said something direct, something that she had decided to say and was going to say straight. She said in her careful English, "Thank you, but I could also handle him myself." Homer looked at her. "I know that," he said, and he meant it entirely. She allowed herself a small smile. "We are good together," she said. "We are," Homer said. They were quiet for a moment in the store with the smells of flour and tobacco and pickled things around them. "Fletcher," Homer said to the storekeeper without looking away from Celia, "I'll take that ring you have in the case, the gold one with the small stone." Fletcher moved without comment to the display case. Celia looked at Homer with an expression that was half surprise and half something that was not surprise at all. "I was going to wait until December," Homer said, "but I find I am not interested in waiting." He bought the ring. He did not, in the store, make a formal thing of it, because that was for somewhere private and proper, but he pressed the small wrapped packet into Celia's hand, and she took it and held it, and they walked out into the November street together where the sky was white and low, and the smell of coming snow was already in the air. He asked her that evening by the fire. In Spanish he had been storing up, working out, making exact. He said that he loved her, and he said it in Spanish first and then in English because he wanted her to have it in both languages, in the full vocabulary of both the lives they were making together. He said he wanted to marry her if she would have him. He said he knew they were still learning each other and that that was all right, that the learning itself was something he wanted for the whole rest of his life. He said, "Quiero aprender contigo para siempre." He wanted to learn with her forever. Celia took his face in both her hands, which was not what he had been expecting, and she looked at him for a long, steady moment with those river-dark eyes, and then she said yes in Spanish and yes in English, and then she said it again in Spanish for good measure, because once did not feel like enough. He put the ring on her finger. It fit. Fletcher had good instincts. They were married in December, 6 weeks later, in the Caldwell church on a Saturday morning, with a thin snow falling outside and making everything quiet and white. Mrs. Aldrich was there in her best dress, crying with the cheerful, unashamed volume of a woman who has earned the right to cry at happy things. Rodrigo stood with Homer, and he was in his best clothes and looked extremely fine and also very pleased with himself, in a way that suggested he was taking some personal credit for the whole affair. The minister spoke in English and Homer translated into Spanish as best he could, which made the ceremony somewhat longer than average and made the minister slightly impatient, but no one else minded at all. When the minister said to Homer, "You may kiss your bride," Homer looked at Celia, and she was already looking at him, and the kiss was brief and real, and Mrs. Aldrich applauded loudly enough for everyone. Afterward there was food at the town hall, potluck fashion, and there was fiddle music, and Homer and Celia danced together to a slow waltz, and his hand was at her waist and her hand was on his shoulder, and the snow kept coming down outside the windows in soft silence. "Are you happy?" he asked her in Spanish. She looked up at him from within the circle of the waltz. "Yes," she said in English, and then added several more sentences in Spanish that told him, in loving and specific detail, that she was happier than she had believed she was allowed to be, that Kansas had given her nothing she expected and everything she needed, and that she intended to be here with him for a very long time. He understood every word. He had worked hard for this, and he knew it. Winter settled over the homestead, and it was a different winter from any Homer had spent on the claim. The house was warm in a way it had not been warm before, not just in temperature, which was the business of the wood stove, but in the deeper sense of a house that has people in it who belong to each other. They learned each other in the dailiness of a shared life, which was a different kind of learning from the courtship, more detailed and more honest, the small recognitions that come from seeing someone at every hour of the day in every kind of mood and circumstance. Homer learned that Celia was not a morning person, which surprised him because she appeared functional and competent in the mornings, but Rodrigo, who had been around long enough to read the signs, informed him that functional and morning person were not the same thing, and that the coffee needed to happen before the conversation. Homer adapted to this with the cheerful practicality of a man who had learned to read weather signs and understood that conditions were conditions. Celia learned that Homer's patience, which appeared bottomless, had exactly one thing that tested it reliably, which was dishonesty. Not mistakes, not problems, not difficulty, all of which he met with the same steady problem-solving calm, but dishonesty, which made him quiet in a particular way that was the emotional equivalent of a closed door. She filed this away as important, and was always, after learning it, completely straight with him, which he recognized and was grateful for in a way he never quite articulated but showed in about 100 small daily kindnesses. Spring came and the prairie turned green, and the kitchen garden expanded again, larger this time with a plan that Celia had drawn out on the large slate Homer had obtained for this purpose. She had a system in mind, rotating crops, a cold frame for early starts, herbs on the south side of the house where they got the most sun. She explained it to Homer with the particular pleasure of someone who has a good plan and an audience who will actually implement it. Homer listened and asked questions in improving Spanish and understood about 70% of the answers, and said so honestly, and she laughed and explained the other 30% more slowly, and they ended up working through the whole garden plan together in the comfortable back and forth of two people who have figured out how to think together. In April, exactly 1 year after Celia had sat in the grass by a broken wagon wheel and watched two riders approach across the Kansas prairie, She told Homer something in the kitchen one evening after supper, quietly, watching his face. She told him in both languages, Spanish first, then English, watching to make sure he had the English too. "We are going to have a child," she said. Homer sat very still for a moment. He was not a demonstrative man, which was a thing Celia knew about him, and which meant she could read the unmistakable demonstration of what she was seeing. The way his eyes went bright, and the breath he let out, and the expression that took over his face, complete and unguarded. The expression of a man confronted with joy so large it has nowhere to go but out. He stood up from the table and came around to her side and took her face in his hands the way she had once taken his. And he said something in Spanish that came out in a rush, imperfect and entirely clear, that he loved her, that he could not believe his luck, that this was more than he had ever thought his life would contain. She was laughing and also, briefly, crying in the way people cry when they are overwhelmingly happy, and he held her, and the kitchen was warm, and the prairie was dark and enormous outside, and inside there was a lamp lit, and two people holding each other who had come at this from such completely different directions and found each other anyway. Rodrigo found out the next morning. He shook Homer's hand with a formality that immediately dissolved into the kind of backslapping that men do when they are moved and do not know another way to express it. And then he went and found Celia in the garden and said something to her in Spanish that made her smile with her whole face. And then he said he was going to ride to Caldwell to inform Mrs. Aldrich, because Mrs. Aldrich would never forgive being the last to know. Mrs. Aldrich arrived by midday. She had opinions about everything: the diet, the sleeping arrangements, the temperature of the house, which Homer accepted as the cost of having someone in his corner who had raised 5 children and buried a husband, and was the most competent person he had met on the frontier. She also arrived with practical gifts, fabric and things she called necessities with the authority of experience, and she and Celia settled into a conversation that Celia's now fluent English made possible in ways it had not been the previous year. Because by spring of 1874, Celia's English was not just functional, it was real. It had the particularity of a language lived in rather than studied, the rhythms of frontier English mixed with the cadences of Spanish in a way that was distinctly her own. And she was beginning to help teach it to a young woman named Paloma, who had arrived in Caldwell with her brother and his family from Chihuahua, and who was trying to find her footing in the same English-speaking world that Celia had navigated a year before. This was the kind of woman Celia Graves Hartwell was, and Homer knew it and was humbled by it. The summer of 1874 was the summer that Vance Caldwell's land speculation operation collapsed. It had been built on debt and pressure and the misfortune of others, and when the railroad route shifted and the land he had acquired at aggressive prices became worth significantly less, the whole structure came apart. He left Caldwell in August with his remaining assets and his 2 men and was not heard from again in that part of Kansas, which suited Homer and most of the other people in the county very well. Homer's land, which Caldwell had tried so hard to acquire, was worth more than ever because of the work that had gone into it, and the cattle herd had grown to 60 head, and the kitchen garden operation was producing enough surplus that the sales at Caldwell Market had become a reliable monthly income. Rodrigo had taken on a second hired hand, a quiet young man named Decker who was good with horses and ate everything placed in front of him with an appreciation that Celia found personally gratifying. The child was born in November of 1874, and he came into the world with a volume that suggested confidence, a boy, which Homer received with a wonderstruck silence that lasted about 30 seconds before he said, in Spanish, because Spanish had become the language of his most important moments, "Es perfecto." He was perfect. They named him Alejandro James Hartwell, Alejandro for Celia's father, James for Homer's father, and he was called both names and neither name and the nickname that Rodrigo immediately applied, which was allegio, and which stuck with the inevitability of good nicknames. He was a healthy and energetic baby who had his mother's dark eyes and his father's broad shoulders even as an infant somehow, and who from the very beginning had the quality of a person who finds everything interesting, which his mother had and his father had in his own quiet way, and which was, apparently, transferable. The winter of that year was cold and long, and the three of them were inside together much of it, Homer and Celia and the baby, and the house that Homer had built with his own hands contained something it had been built for without him knowing it, the warmth of a family, the particular noise and light of people who love each other occupying a space together. Homer's Spanish was, by this point, genuinely good. Not perfect, not always grammatically precise, but real and communicative and entirely his own, marked by the same careful attentiveness he had brought to every other difficult thing he had learned in his life. Celia's English was excellent. They moved between the two languages in the fluid, uncalculating way of people who have stopped thinking of them as separate things and started thinking of them as two registers of a single shared voice. There was a morning in February. The baby sleeping in the cradle Homer had made from the good ash timber he had been keeping in the barn for something important, and the snow coming down outside in the large, gentle flakes that meant it would be deep by afternoon, and Celia sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee and the small journal she kept, writing in Spanish in the careful cursive the nuns had taught her. Homer was reading, which was a thing he did more now, partly because Celia had opinions about it and had introduced him to several books he would not have found on his own, and the house was warm and quiet except for the fire and the baby's small sleeping sounds. Homer looked up from his book. Celia was writing, her dark hair loose because it was morning and because she trusted him with her morning self, which he had always understood as a kind of intimacy. The snow made the light from the window white and diffuse, and the lamp on the table made the kitchen gold. He said her name. She looked up. He said in Spanish, "I never told you the thing I think about on the day we met." She waited, interested. He said, "I almost did not ride that way. Rodrigo suggested we take the longer road because the horse had a stone bruise and the shorter road is rougher. I said no, the shorter road, because I wanted to get home sooner. That is all, one small choice. If I had taken the longer road, I would never have seen you." Celia looked at him for a long moment. "Where do you think I would have gone?" she asked. "I don't know," he said. "I do," she said. She said it with the certainty of someone who has thought about this. "I would have waited, I had nowhere else to go, and someone else would have come along the road eventually, but they would not have been you." She looked at the fire for a moment. "I think about the wheel," she said. "If the wheel had not broken, I would have arrived in Caldwell and found a situation, and that would have been that." She looked back at him. "A broken wheel sent me to you." Homer thought about this. Then he said in English, because some things he wanted to say in the language he had spoken all his life, "I am very grateful for that wheel." Celia smiled. Then she said also in English, "So am I." The baby made a small sound in the cradle, not a waking sound, just a sleeping baby sound, the kind that pulls the attention of parents without requiring any action. They both looked at him for a moment, and then at each other, and there was something in that shared look at their son that was its own complete language, fluent and exact, that did not need translation in either direction. The years settled into themselves the way good years do, each one adding to the last, the farm growing and the family growing, and the two languages of the Hartwell household becoming a single integrated thing, that their son grew up inside of with the easy fluency of a child who has never known them to be separate. Rodrigo married in the spring of 1876, a woman named Francisca from Caldwell, who was a seamstress and a very good one, and who took an immediate and permanent liking to Celia, and who became part of the household in the easy way of people who fit without being asked. Rodrigo built a proper small house on the north corner of Homer's land, where he had been working for 9 years, and where he clearly intended to be working for the rest of his life. and Homer sold him the land at a price that Rodrigo declared was robbery in the other direction, and that Homer declared was exactly right. Mrs. Aldrich came every week, on Thursdays, until she was very old, and the Thursday visits were something that the Hartwell house organized itself around with the affection of a long-established tradition. She had opinions about everything always, and she was almost always right, and she watched Alejandro grow with the fond proprietary attention of a grandmother of the heart, which was what she was. She taught him English the same way she had taught Celia, with patience and the occasional well-chosen profanity that she claimed was pedagogically useful, and which Celia accepted with more amusement than she showed. The second child came in the winter of 1877, a daughter, and they named her Rosa Eliza Hartwell, Rosa for the Spanish Rose that had been Celia's grandmother's name, Eliza for Mrs. Aldrich, whose name was Eliza Aldrich, and who received this information with such a forceful expression of feeling that she had to sit down, and who then stood back up and declared herself permanently responsible for the girl's education. Rosa was a different child from her brother, quieter and more watchful, with Homer's gray-blue eyes in Celia's face, and she had from very early on the quality of a person who is taking very thorough notes on everything around her and will deploy them at unexpected moments. The farm at the end of the 1870s was a going concern in the full sense of the phrase. 100 head of cattle, the kitchen garden operation that Celia had expanded into a small but genuine enterprise. The house extended twice to accommodate the growing family and the regular visitors, and the land itself green and worked and alive with the evidence of people who had cared for it over years. Homer stood at the fence of the north pasture one evening in the summer of 1878 watching the sunset, which was doing what Kansas sunsets do with a kind of extravagant theatrical commitment, all orange and rose and deep violet stacked on each other above the flat western horizon. Celia came and stood beside him, and Rosa was on her hip, because the baby was at the age where she required to be on someone's hip at all times as a condition of her contentment, and Alejandro was somewhere behind them in the grass doing something with a stick that involved intense personal satisfaction. "Do you remember," Homer said, in the mixed language that was their shared idiom, the one that slid back and forth between English and Spanish without ceremony, when we could not say anything to each other? Celia leaned her shoulder against his. "I remember," she said. "We managed anyway," he said. "We managed," she agreed, and the word included everything, the year of gestures and slate boards and Rodrigo translating, and the slow accumulation of each other's languages, and the long evenings by the fire, and the first time he had taken her hand, and the garden proposal, and the November wedding in the snow, and the children and the years and the land. Rosa patted Celia's face with a plump hand, requiring attention. "All right," Celia said to her daughter in the easy bilingual mixture that was Rosa's first language. "All right, I see you." Alejandro appeared at Homer's elbow. "Papa," he said, "there is a very good stick." "Show me," Homer said, and Alejandro took his hand with the unquestioning confidence of a child who has never had a reason not to, and led him toward the grass. Celia watched her husband crouch down to examine whatever engineering project her son had assembled in the pasture grass, and the light was on them both, and the prairie went golden and vast in every direction, and she thought about the wagon wheel and the flat road, and the moment she had looked up and seen two riders coming across the grass toward her. One of them a man with gray-blue eyes who would learn her language and make her a home and love her through every season of a life that was real and whole and hers. She held her daughter and watched the sunset and was grateful, in both languages and beyond them, for the whole of it. In the years that followed, the Hartwell homestead became something of an anchor in the community, a place people came and went from with the comfortable frequency of somewhere that always had food and welcome and the particular warmth of a household that knows itself. Rodrigo and Francisca had their own children, 3 of them, who grew up alongside Alejandro and Rosa like the cousins they were in everything but blood. Mrs. Aldrich grew old in her house 2 miles east and died on a Thursday morning in 1881 at the age of 73, having completed her Thursday visit the week before, and declared Homer's new bull an improvement and Rosa's reading progress satisfactory, and eaten 2 tamales, and told Celia that she was the best thing that had ever happened to that stubborn patient man. And Celia had held her hands and said, in English that was now as natural to her as breathing, that Eliza Aldrich was the best thing that had ever happened to her in Kansas, which was saying something, and Mrs. Aldrich had laughed and gone home and died in her sleep, which was the death she would have chosen. They buried her on the hill behind the Caldwell church, and Homer spoke at the grave, and Celia stood beside him with her hand in his and the children beside them, and Rodrigo held his hat in his hands and Francisca wept, and the whole community of the Kansas Prairie stood in the afternoon sun to say goodbye to a woman who had held a great deal of it together. A third child came in the spring of 1882. A boy again, and they named him Samuel Thomas Hartwell. Samuel because it was a name they both liked, and Thomas for Rodrigo's father who had died the previous year. He arrived with the same confident volume as his brother and the same watchful dark eyes as his sister, and the same quality that all three Hartwell children had, which was a kind of fundamental groundedness, an ease in their own skin that came, Celia thought, from being raised inside the knowledge that they were wanted and loved in 2 languages, and belonged to a place that was genuinely theirs. Samuel grew to be a child who loved the cattle with a passion that delighted Homer, and spent hours at Rodrigo's side learning things about horses that Homer had never thought to teach, and that Rodrigo had in abundance. By the time he was walking steadily, he was following men twice his size around the barn with the purposeful air of someone completing an apprenticeship. Alejandro, who was 10 by the time Samuel arrived, took his role as eldest with a seriousness that made his parents exchange glances sometimes, both of them seeing themselves in different aspects of him, Celia's directness and Homer's patience. The 2 of them somehow distilled and recombined into this dark-eyed, earnest boy who spoke English and Spanish with equal fluency, and had strong opinions about cattle management, and was going to be, Homer thought, someone that this land would remember. Rosa was something different, something that surprised both her parents in the best possible way. She had from early on the quality of a person who is going to do something specific and important, and who is aware of this before anyone else is. By the age of 7, she had read everything in the house, including Homer's accounting ledgers and the Spanish grammar that still sat on the shelf, and she had declared that she intended to be a teacher, which Mrs. Aldrich had predicted before her death, and which Celia received as entirely natural and right. Homer built an extension on the house in 1884 that gave each child a proper room, and that added a sitting room with bookshelves that Celia immediately filled with every book she could acquire, by purchase and borrowing and occasional creative acquisition, because she believed in this with the conviction of someone who knew what words could build between people who had no other bridge. There was an evening in the autumn of 1884 when Alejandro was 12 and Rosa was 7, and Samuel was 2.5 and had recently discovered the particular power of the word no. And the house was full of the noise of children and cooking, and Rodrigo had come over for dinner, and Francisca was telling a story that had everyone laughing, and Homer looked at Celia across the table in the middle of all of it. She was laughing at something Rodrigo had said, her head tipped back slightly, the way she laughed when she found something genuinely funny, and the lamp was on her, and the room was full and warm, and Homer thought about sitting on a porch with a woman he could not speak to, and showing her the Spanish word for good evening, which was the first Spanish he had said to her, and how far the distance was between that moment and this one. She felt him looking and looked back at him, and the question was in her eyes, The easy, comfortable question of someone who has known someone for 11 years and still finds them interesting. He said it in Spanish, quietly under the noise of the room, so it was just for her. "Thank you," he said. She looked at him for a moment. She knew what he meant, that it was not a specific thank you for a specific thing, but the large gratitude, the one that included all of it. She had learned to recognize it, and she felt it herself, that deep and particular thankfulness for the accident of a broken wheel on a Kansas road. "We are even," she said in English, which was the language of her daily life and her children's first language and the language she had built herself from nothing on this prairie. And she smiled at him, and he smiled back, and Rodrigo noticed, and said something that made Francisca laugh, and the table fell into Spanish for the rest of the evening. All of them. The children too, bouncing between the two languages like the bilingual frontier family they had become. A small proof that the distance between people is almost always shorter than it looks from the outside. The land was Homer's, had been Homer's by law and by labor for 15 years and more, and it was Celia's by the same law and by the same labor, and by every hour of every year she had put into it, every row of the kitchen garden and every cord of wood stacked, and every meal that had fed the people who worked it. And every evening she had sat on that porch watching the prairie do what prairies do, which is continue in every direction forever with a patience and an indifference that you either make peace with or you leave. She had made peace with it. She had made more than peace. She had made a life inside it that was larger than anything she had imagined in Guadalajara, larger than the careful arithmetic of what she had hoped for when she crossed the border with her few words of English and her mother's rosary. The rosary hung on a nail above the kitchen window, where the light hit it in the mornings, and she said the prayers sometimes, quietly, in the Spanish she had been given from birth, and sometimes she said them in English because she had built enough of a life in that language that her faith had moved into it too, and sometimes she just looked at it and felt the weight of the distance traveled, and thought that her mother, who had pressed it into her hands at the door of a house in Guadalajara, would have had a great deal to say about all of this, and most of it would have been wonderful. Homer had started writing things down. He had not been a writing man, but Celia had argued, in the gentle and persistent way she argued things she believed were right, that the children should know the story of the farm, where it had come from and what it had cost and what it had given. And Homer had begun keeping a record in a ledger book, not accounts but history, and he wrote in English and left spaces that Celia filled in Spanish. So the ledger was bilingual too, like the household, like the children, like the whole of it. He wrote about the day he rode the short road home from Caldwell instead of the long road. He wrote about the broken wagon and the woman sitting in the grass with her bag pressed to her chest. He wrote about learning Spanish with a grammar book by lamplight after everyone else was asleep, the words that would not stay and the words that finally did. He wrote about the garden, the first real conversation on the porch, the day he bought a ring from Fletcher in the general store because he found he was not interested in waiting. He wrote in English, which was his language for the things he had no adequate Spanish for yet. I have been given more than I deserved, and I know it. I do not know what the mechanism is by which the right wheel breaks on the right road at the right time, but I will say this. I rode the short road, and I am grateful for it every day of my life. Celia read this, sitting at the kitchen table in the morning with her coffee, and she was quiet for a long time after, and then she picked up the pen and wrote below it in Spanish, which was her language for the things that went deepest. She wrote, "And I waited by the broken wagon because my mother told me to stay still when I was lost so the people who loved me could find me. She did not know she was giving me directions. Neither did I, but here we are." Homer read this in the evening. He stood at the kitchen table with the ledger open and read it, and was quiet, the particular quality of quiet that he had when something had moved him past the point where words were useful. Then he went and found Celia on the porch, where she was sitting in the last of the October light watching the prairie go golden, and he sat down beside her in the chair he had put there years ago that was always his chair. and he took her hand, and they watched the sun go down over the Kansas prairie in the long golden silence of two people who had found each other across the distance of two languages and a broken wagon wheel, and all the years between then and now, and who were. In every language either of them possessed home, the children grew, the land grew with them. Alejandro became the rancher his father had seen in him, steady and serious and good with cattle and better with people. And he married a woman named Clara from a neighboring family and brought her home to the land as Homer had once made a home there for Celia, and the tradition of welcome was carried forward. Rosa became a teacher, as she had declared she would, and opened a small school in Caldwell that taught children in English and Spanish, because she had grown up knowing that language was not a wall, and she intended to make sure the children she taught knew it too. Samuel was the horseman Rodrigo had seen in him, and by the time he was grown, he was known across 4 counties for the quality of the horses he raised and trained on the Hartwell land. The homestead that Homer had filed on in 1868 when he was 25 years old with nothing but the government's offer and his own stubbornness was, by the end of the 1880s, a real ranch, something built by 2 people who had come at it from completely different directions and made it together in 2 languages, and the language beyond both of them that did not have a name, but was entirely legible to anyone who paid attention. Homer and Celia grew old on it in the way that people grow old on land they love, slowly and without regret, the work changing as they changed, the years adding their weight and their richness in equal measure. Their hair went gray, his first and then hers, and the lines of their faces were the lines of people who had spent their lives outdoors in a climate that did not apologize, and they were, in their older years, the same people they had always been but more fully, as though time had concentrated them. There were evenings on the porch that were very like the first porch evening, the 2 of them sitting in the last light watching the prairie, the silence between them as comfortable as it had always been, more comfortable even, seasoned by all the years, all the conversations in 2 languages, all the knowing. "Do you still think in Spanish?" he asked her once on one of those evenings. He asked it in Spanish. She thought about it. "I think in both," she said, "depending on the subject." "What subject do you think about in Spanish?" he asked. She looked at the prairie for a moment. "The land," she said, "the children, you." He was quiet. "And in English?" he asked. She smiled. "The cattle," she said, "the accounts, the weather." He laughed, which was a sound she had loved since the first time she heard it fully, all those years ago in the kitchen over a Spanish pantomime that had gone wrong. He had a good laugh, low and genuine, the laugh of a man who was not always laughing but meant it when he did. "And what language," she said, "do you think about me in?" He looked at her. "Both," he said, "whatever one I'm in, and sometimes neither." She raised an eyebrow, waiting. "Sometimes," he said, "there is not a word for it in either language. It is just you." The prairie held them in its enormous silence. The light went rose and then the deep transparent violet of the Kansas evening, and somewhere out in the grass the cattle moved with their patient sound, and the house behind them held the warmth of their life and the people they had made, and the world was very large and they were very small in it, which was all right because they were small in it together. Celia took his hand. He held it. The stars came out over Kansas the way they always had and always would, extravagant and indifferent and beautiful. And below them the 2 people on the porch were neither. They were particular and attentive and full of feeling for each other, and for the long road that had brought them to the same porch on the same prairie on this evening, and all the evenings before it, and all the evenings still to come. This was the story of a broken wheel and a short road, and a woman who waited in the grass and a man who came along and could not speak her language but learned it, word by careful word, in the lamplight of a house that became a home because they were both in it. This was the story of Celia Graves and Homer Hartwell, and the love that found no barrier on the prairie because they were both, in their different and complementary ways, the kind of people who did not believe in barriers, who believed instead in patience and attention and the slow accumulation of understanding between 2 people willing to build it. The land was theirs. The life was theirs. The years were theirs. And they were each other's in English and in Spanish and in every language beyond.